Hello and welcome to Forgotten Genius, a quiet place where we slow down and remember the people history tried to forget. Tonight, we'll trace the quiet footsteps of someone whose brilliance once lit the world, only to be buried, stolen, or overlooked. We don't tell these stories to memorize names or achievements, but to feel what it was like to matter deeply and be erased anyway. Whether you're winding down for the night or just taking a breath from the noise, I'm truly glad you're here. If calm, thoughtful storytelling helps you connect with the past in a deeper way, feel free to subscribe. There's always another forgotten genius waiting in the shadows. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. Let's take a moment to set the stage. The year is 1879, and the world is a very different place from the one we know today. Disease stalks every corner of human existence like a relentless predator. Mothers watch helplessly as their children succumb to illnesses we can barely imagine fearing now. Entire communities are devastated by epidemics that sweep through with the regularity of seasonal storms. In this world, death is not a distant concept but a daily companion, and the average person can expect to live perhaps 40 years if they're fortunate. It's into this landscape of suffering and uncertainty that our story begins, in a small laboratory tucked away in the heart of Paris, where a man works alone by flickering gaslight, surrounded by glass vials and mysterious cultures that most people would flee from in terror. This man, whose name would soon be whispered in scientific circles but never quite reach the fame it deserved, was about to change the trajectory of human history, with a discovery so profound that it would save more lives than any military victory or political achievement ever could. His name was Louis Pasteur, and while many know him for pasteurization, few understand the true magnitude of what he accomplished in the realm of vaccines. But even more forgotten is the story of how he developed the rabies vaccine, a breakthrough that would establish the blueprint for modern immunology and set in motion a cascade of medical advances that continue to save millions of lives today. The story begins not with triumph, but with terror. In the summer of 1885, a mother named Jeanne Meister travelled from the small village of Maissengot in Alsace to Paris, carrying her 9-year-old son Joseph in her arms. The boy had been savagely attacked by a rabid dog 2 days earlier, suffering 14 brutal bites across his hands, legs and thighs. In that era, such an attack was essentially a death sentence. Rabies was one of the most feared diseases known to humanity, with a mortality rate approaching 100% once symptoms appeared. The journey to Paris was one of desperation. Jeanne had heard whispers of a scientist who was working on something unprecedented, something that might save her son from the horrible death that awaited him. Rabies, once it took hold, was a nightmare beyond description. Victims would become increasingly agitated, developing an intense fear of water that made swallowing impossible, before descending into violent convulsions and madness. The disease would consume its victims slowly, allowing them to remain conscious as their bodies betrayed them, until finally, mercifully, death would take them. Pasteur was not a medical doctor. He was a chemist by training, a man who had spent his career studying the invisible world of microorganisms. His laboratory was more chemistry lab than medical facility, filled with test tubes, microscopes, and cultures that most physicians of the day would have dismissed as irrelevant to the practice of medicine. But Pasteur had a theory, one that flew in the face of conventional medical wisdom. For centuries, doctors had believed that diseases were caused by bad air, or imbalances in the body's humours. The idea that tiny, invisible creatures could cause illness was not just revolutionary, it was almost heretical. But Pasteur had already proven that microorganisms could spoil wine and beer, leading to his development of pasteurization. Now he was convinced that these same principles could be applied to infectious diseases. When Jeanne Meister arrived at his laboratory with young Joseph, Pasteur faced an impossible decision. He had been working on a rabies vaccine for years, testing it on dogs with remarkable success, but he had never used it on a human being. The vaccine itself was dangerous. It contained live, weakened rabies virus that could potentially cause the very disease it was meant to prevent. If he gave it to the boy and the child died, Pasteur would be guilty of murder. If he didn't give it to the boy, the child would almost certainly die anyway. Pasteur spent the night walking the streets of Paris, wrestling with a decision. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures or quick decisions. Every aspect of his personality was methodical, careful, precise. He had built his reputation on solid experimental evidence, not on desperate gambles. But as he thought of the boy lying in his makeshift hospital bed, fighting against time itself, Pasteur realized that sometimes science required not just intellect, but courage. The next morning, on July 6, 1885, Pasteur administered the first dose of his experimental rabies vaccine to Joseph Meister. The vaccine consisted of dried spinal cord material from rabbits that had been infected with rabies, then gradually weakened through a complex process that Pasteur had developed through countless experiments. The theory was that by exposing the boy to progressively stronger doses of the weakened virus, his body would develop immunity before the live virus from the dog bite could take hold. For the next 2 weeks, Joseph received daily injections while Pasteur monitored his condition with the intensity of a man watching his own child. The entire scientific community was watching as well. Word had spread about the experiment, and letters poured in from around the world. Some praised Pasteur's boldness. Others condemned him as a reckless charlatan who was endangering a child's life for the sake of his own reputation. As the days passed, Joseph showed no signs of developing rabies. More importantly, he showed no signs of becoming ill from the vaccine itself. When the treatment was complete, Pasteur could only wait and pray. The incubation period for rabies could be several months, meaning that even if the treatment worked, it would be a long time before anyone could be certain. But Joseph Meister never developed rabies. In fact, he lived a full and healthy life, eventually becoming the caretaker of the Pasteur Institute, a fitting tribute to the man who had saved him as a child. The success of this first human trial marked the beginning of a new era in medicine, one in which humanity would no longer have to stand helpless in the face of infectious disease. However, Pasteur's story is not just one of scientific triumph. It's also a story of how genius can be overshadowed by politics, ego, and the simple passage of time. Despite the revolutionary nature of his work, Pasteur found himself embroiled in bitter disputes with other scientists who questioned his methods and his results. The scientific establishment of the day was not ready to accept that a chemist could revolutionize medicine, and many physicians saw his work as an intrusion into their domain. The development of the rabies vaccine was not just a matter of scientific insight. It was a feat of incredible persistence and resourcefulness. Pasteur had to overcome not just the technical challenges of creating a vaccine, but also the practical problems of obtaining and maintaining the materials he needed. Rabies virus could only be obtained from infected animals, and keeping these animals alive long enough to harvest the virus required a level of animal husbandry that was beyond the capabilities of most laboratories. Pasteur's approach was methodical to the point of obsession. He would infect rabbits with rabies virus, wait for the disease to develop, then harvest their spinal cords. These cords were then dried in special chambers for varying periods of time, creating vaccines of different strengths. The process was dangerous, time-consuming, and expensive, but Pasteur was convinced that it was the only way to create a reliable vaccine. The success with Joseph Meister was just the beginning. Word of the treatment spread rapidly, and soon people were traveling from across Europe and beyond to receive Pasteur's vaccine. Each case was a new experiment, a new test of the vaccine's effectiveness. Pasteur kept meticulous records of every patient, documenting not just their survival, but their symptoms, their response to treatment, and their long-term health. But success brought new challenges. The demand for the vaccine far exceeded Pasteur's ability to produce it. His laboratory was overwhelmed with patients, and he lacked the resources to treat everyone who came to him. The French government, initially skeptical of his work, began to take notice as the success stories mounted. But bureaucratic support came slowly, and Pasteur found himself struggling to fund his research while simultaneously treating patients. The scientific community's response was mixed. While some hailed Pasteur as a hero, others remained skeptical. The mechanism by which vaccines worked was still poorly understood, and many scientists questioned whether Pasteur's successes were due to the vaccine itself or simply to the fact that not everyone bitten by a rabid animal would develop the disease. This skepticism was not entirely unfounded. The incubation period for rabies was variable, and it was difficult to prove definitively that a person would have developed the disease without treatment. Pasteur's response to his critics was characteristically methodical. He began conducting controlled experiments, comparing the survival rates of vaccinated versus unvaccinated patients. He also began collaborating with other scientists, sharing his techniques and encouraging them to replicate his results. Slowly, the evidence mounted in favor of his approach. The success of the rabies vaccine established Pasteur as one of the most important figures in the history of medicine, but it also marked the beginning of a new kind of scientific career, one that combined pure research with practical application. Pasteur found himself not just a scientist, but a public figure, responsible for the health and well-being of thousands of people who sought his treatment. The Pasteur Institute, founded in 1888, became a model for medical research institutions around the world. It combined laboratory research with clinical treatment, creating a new paradigm for how medical science could be conducted. The institute's work extended far beyond rabies, encompassing research into cholera, diphtheria, tetanus, and other infectious diseases. But perhaps the most important legacy of Pasteur's work was not any single vaccine or treatment, but the principle that infectious diseases could be prevented through scientific intervention. Before Pasteur, medicine was largely reactive, focused on treating symptoms after they appeared. Pasteur's work demonstrated that it was possible to prevent disease before it occurred, fundamentally changing the relationship between humanity and infectious disease. The impact of this shift cannot be overstated. In the centuries following Pasteur's work, vaccines would be developed for dozens of diseases that had previously been death sentences. Polio, measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis, and many others would be brought under control through vaccination programs. The principles that Pasteur established with his rabies vaccine would be refined and expanded, leading to the development of increasingly sophisticated vaccines that could protect against multiple diseases simultaneously. Yet despite these monumental achievements, Pasteur's story is also one of personal struggle and sacrifice. The work took an enormous toll on his health and his family life. He suffered multiple strokes during his career, the first one occurring when he was just 45 years old. The stress of his research, combined with the constant pressure of treating patients whose lives hung in the balance, left him physically and emotionally drained. His family paid a price as well. Pasteur's wife, Marie, became an integral part of his research, assisting in the laboratory and helping to care for patients. Their children grew up in the shadow of their father's work, witnessing both the triumphs and the tragedies that came with being at the forefront of medical research. The Pasteur household was not a typical family home. It was a place where scientific discovery and human suffering intersected on a daily basis. The financial pressures were also enormous. Despite his growing reputation, Pasteur struggled to secure adequate funding for his research. The French government provided some support, but it was often insufficient to meet the demands of his work. Private donors helped, but they came with their own expectations and requirements. Pasteur found himself constantly balancing the need to pursue his research with the necessity of securing the resources to continue his work. The international recognition that came with his success was both a blessing and a burden. While it brought prestige and additional funding opportunities, it also brought scrutiny and criticism. Every failure was examined in detail, every success was questioned. Pasteur became a public figure whose every move was watched and analyzed, not just by the scientific community, but by the general public as well. Despite these challenges, Pasteur continued to innovate and discover. His work on anthrax led to the development of one of the first bacterial vaccines, demonstrating that the principles he had established with rabies could be applied to other diseases. His research on cholera, while less successful than his other work, contributed to the understanding of how infectious diseases spread and how they could be controlled. The legacy of Pasteur's work extends far beyond the specific vaccines he developed. His approach to scientific research, combining careful observation with controlled experimentation, became the gold standard for medical research. His emphasis on the practical application of scientific knowledge helped to establish the field of applied microbiology. His willingness to take risks and to challenge established medical doctrine opened the door for future researchers to pursue unconventional approaches to medical problems. But perhaps most importantly, Pasteur's work established the principle that scientific knowledge could be used to improve human welfare on a massive scale. The vaccines he developed saved thousands of lives during his lifetime, but the principles he established have saved millions of lives in the decades since his death. Every child who receives a routine vaccination is a beneficiary of the work that Pasteur began in his small laboratory in Paris. The story of Louis Pasteur and the rabies vaccine is not just a story of scientific achievement, it's a story of human courage and determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. It's a story of how one person's refusal to accept the status quo can change the course of history. It's a story of how scientific knowledge, when combined with compassion and determination, can triumph over ignorance and fear. As we look back on Pasteur's life and work, we are reminded of the power of scientific inquiry to transform the human condition. In an era when disease was seen as an inevitable part of life, Pasteur dared to imagine a world where infectious diseases could be prevented. His vision was not just scientific, it was deeply humanistic, driven by a desire to reduce suffering and to give people the opportunity to live longer, healthier lives. The rabies vaccine was just the beginning. The principles that Pasteur established will be carried forward by generations of researchers who would build upon his work to develop vaccines for an ever-expanding list of diseases. The World Health Organization's successful campaign to eradicate smallpox, completed in 1980, was a direct descendant of Pasteur's work. The development of vaccines for polio, measles, and dozens of other diseases followed the same basic principles that Pasteur had established. Today, as we face new challenges in the form of emerging infectious diseases and vaccine-resistant pathogens, Pasteur's legacy continues to guide our response. The rapid development of vaccines for COVID-19, accomplished in record time through international cooperation and advanced technology, builds upon the foundation that Pasteur laid more than a century ago. But Pasteur's story also reminds us that scientific progress is not inevitable. It requires dedicated individuals who are willing to challenge conventional wisdom, to take risks, and to persist in the face of skepticism and opposition. It requires institutions that can support long-term research and that can bridge the gap between laboratory discoveries and practical applications. Most importantly, it requires a society that values scientific inquiry and that is willing to invest in the pursuit of knowledge for the betterment of humanity. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we can take comfort in knowing that the world we inhabit is fundamentally different from the one that Louis Pasteur knew. The diseases that once terrorized entire populations are now largely controlled through vaccination. Children can grow up without fear of polio or measles. Travelers can visit foreign countries without worrying about contracting rabies or cholera. These improvements in human welfare are not the result of luck or chance. They are the direct result of the work that Pasteur began in his small laboratory in Paris. The story of Louis Pasteur and the rabies vaccine is a testament to the power of human ingenuity and compassion to overcome even the most daunting challenges. It's a story of how one person's dedication to scientific truth can benefit millions of people across generations. It's a story that reminds us that the greatest achievements in human history often come not from those who seek fame or fortune, but from those who are driven by a simple desire to reduce suffering and to make the world a better place. In the end, Pasteur's legacy is not just the vaccines he developed or the principles he established. It's the idea that human beings need not be passive victims of disease and suffering, but can actively work to improve their condition through the application of scientific knowledge. It's the belief that every life has value and that no effort is too great if it can save even one person from unnecessary suffering. As we close this chapter on one of history's most forgotten heroes, we are reminded that the true measure of a life well lived is not the recognition it receives, but the impact it has on the lives of others. Louis Pasteur may not be as widely remembered as some of his contemporaries, but his work continues to save lives every day. Every vaccine given, every life saved, every family that remains whole because of the protection provided by immunization is a testament to his enduring legacy. The boy who walked into Pasteur's laboratory in 1885, facing certain death from rabies, walked out 2 weeks later with a future full of possibilities. That transformation, from certain death to a life of hope, is the true miracle of Pasteur's work. It's a miracle that has been repeated millions of times in the century and a half since that first rabies vaccine was administered. So tonight, as we remember Louis Pasteur and the vaccine that changed the world, let us also remember that each of us has the potential to make a difference, to leave the world a little better than we found it, whether through scientific discovery, acts of compassion, or simply by living our lives with purpose and integrity. We all have the opportunity to contribute to the great human project of reducing suffering and increasing happiness. The story of the forgotten man who saved millions with a single vaccine is not just a story of the past, it's a story that continues to unfold today, in laboratories and clinics around the world, wherever dedicated individuals work to push back the boundaries of human suffering and to expand the possibilities of human flourishing. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that humanity's greatest triumphs often come from the most humble beginnings, and that the power to change the world lies within each of us, waiting to be discovered and shared.